Well, hello and welcome to our look at the Bible book by book. Today we're looking at the Book of Deuteronomy. The first thing you ought to know about the Book of Deuteronomy is don't come to this book expecting too much to be new or different. Deuteronomy is taken from a Greek word which means to tell over again. This is just a retelling of the story that has gone from Exodus through Numbers, with yes, some new material and some material recast so that it emphasizes different aspects of material. So there's not really a whole lot that's new, but it's still worth reading in that it can tell us a slightly different story of Israel's relationship to God and give us new insight for how we live out our lives with God. The book is divided into three parts. These are three major speeches by Moses. The first 4 chapters are the first speech. Chapters 5 through 26 are the second speech, and then chapters 27 and following are the last speech. And the setting of the book is meant to be Moses' last couple of days or day with the people of Israel before he dies. The book is the narrative is set around Moses' death. However, if you talk to most scholars, they'll say that this book is probably much later than that time frame, at least as in the final form. That doesn't mean that there couldn't have been some historical element that the book was built around. It's just in its final form, it's much later than what it says. And the evidence for that comes from the fact that Moses, at the end of the book, is prophesying about a prophet who be raised up in the people. The book then goes on to say, and to this day, no one has been raised up like Moses, which obviously tells us that the book is significantly later. If I were to talk about even a pastor of the church I'm at from 20 years ago, I would not say, and to this day, no pastor has arisen like so-and-so. That's just not a time frame that's reasonable, at least not in that setting. I mean, I might say in passing, hey, nobody's been able to do this since then, but over 20 years, that really isn't a huge time frame. Now, if we say that in our tradition, in our Methodist tradition, there hasn't been another leader like John Wesley, that's been 250 years. Well, that makes a huge difference. That's when we start to say, oh, something that now we see a pattern here. This man truly was great. He was different. And that's what the book of Deuteronomy is trying to tell us. So we understand that the book, at least how we have it now, was not written by Moses. Obviously, Moses couldn't write about his own death, but just the whole nature of the book, this is artfully composed, looking back to Moses and who he was. So let's dig into it a little bit. The first 4 chapters are basically a recap of everything that's happened in Exodus, the second half of Exodus, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. It's kind of the story of Israel. This is what brought us to this point. We are presented with the historical material that sets the stage for Israel entering the Promised Land. The whole book is about here you are on the cusp of entering into God's promise. So here's what you need to know. That's the storyline of the book. You're about to enter God's promise. You're about to enter your rest. good things are about to happen. Here's what you need to know. So the first speech is all about how did we get to this point, because you cannot know where you're going unless you know where you've been. We can't have an idea of whether our lives are improving or not unless we know where our lives have been. So that's the first part of the book. And then we transition in that middle section to here is the ideal. This is what God has laid out for you. It starts off in, you'll notice this in chapter 5, the first speech, or the first section of the second speech is the Ten Commandments. So right away, here's where you came from. Here is the rules. Here are the rules to live by. Here is God's desired path for you to walk. And we can see kind of the logical framework. And the Ten Commandments are listed, and it culminates really in chapter 6. And when we look at chapter 6, Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, and with all your strength. This becomes the keystone phrase, this keystone verse of the entire book. So you have this outline of the Ten Commandments, and then love the Lord, and then everything else. So the rest of the speech that's built on, or the rest of the speech that's all these ways to live. Here's how you handle this situation. Here's how you live in tune with God. Is all built on that one section of Deuteronomy 6, 1 through 4. So that becomes this linchpin to tell Israel, as you are going through your lives, as you're entering this new land, this new chapter in your life, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, and with all of your strength. And then Moses begins to break down how to live. These are the commands that you need to keep. This is how you keep God's law in your heart. This is how you live out your lives as God's people entering into God's new land. And that's something we need to keep in mind as we're reading it. There are principles there, even though some of the laws are going to sound strange to us. There are principles there that still apply to us. So maybe when we're reading books like Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, some of the punishments might sound strange. Some of the ways that the laws are constructed might sound strange. But the overall principle is something we can still look at and go, oh yeah, that's exactly what I need to do. I need to consider my neighbor as I am working around my yard. I need to be considerate of my neighbor as I am living out my life, because my neighbor has the same rights that I do. And that's the bulk of that section, that second speech. Between that and the laws and the regulations on how to worship, just like we saw in Leviticus. And then we get to this third speech, this final speech of Moses, and we get the kind of the blessings and the curses and the prophecies for how Israel is going to live in the land. We see this kind of play. You can choose to live by God's laws, or you can choose not to live by God's laws. If you choose to live by God's laws, then here's what's going to happen. You're going to have these wonderful blessings in your life. If you choose not to live by God's laws, eventually you're going to go into exile and die. And it's going to be bad. Now, we understand that that's somewhat of a simplistic notion, and I think that even the authors of the Bible wanted us to understand that that's somewhat of a simplistic notion. They want us to see the fact that this is a very simple way of living, but as a rule it's right. Live by God's ways and things go right for you. Live against God and generally speaking things go wrong. Does that mean it's universal? No. Does that mean that bad things can't happen to good people and good things can't happen to bad people? No. Look at the Psalms, look at Job. That's a theme throughout the Bible. But Deuteronomy is focused on this is how we ought to be. I also like the fact that in this book, Moses looks forward to the time when Israel has a king. It would be another, according to the stories of Joshua, Judges, Ruth, a couple hundred years before Israel will have a king. Well, Moses looks forward and he says, when you have a king, the ideal ruler should be somebody who sits around and meditates on the words of God's law. In other words, the ideal king is somebody who daily is reading probably Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. This person should pretty much have them memorized but still continue to read them. Somebody who can give wise rulings based on these books. Someone who can show devotion. What's a bad king? Someone who amasses gold and silver. Someone who enacts forced slave labor. A bad king is someone who collects women and wives as if they're property, just like the gold and silver. In other words, and the bad king is somebody who has this standing army who's always waging war. The bad king is somebody who treats people like property and selfish gain. So, as we look through the books of the kings, so specifically from the time Saul takes over all the way through the end of 2 Kings, that period in Samuel through Kings where we have monarchs, what do we see time and time again? Yeah. Kings who abuse women. Kings who abuse the people with forced labor. Kings who amass silver and gold and property. Kings who will kill to amass property. Kings who have these standing armies who don't take into account the people and just are violent, egocentric people. There isn't a single king who lives out the story of Deuteronomy, at least as reported by Samuel and Kings. Even the kings that we like to celebrate and laud, like David and Solomon, you look at them and they're both abusive towards women. They collect women as possessions. They are furthering their own possessions by building elaborate houses and collecting gold and silver. They engage in, they abuse the people by either engaging in warfare and just keeping this huge military so that they can be violent, bloody kings who expand their empire, or they force the people into slave labor. And so there's this conflict that we're supposed to see that, while Israel, the nation, is this on this roller coaster later, thriving and falling. Deuteronomy is always sitting there in the back of our minds going, and if you're thinking about these passages, you're like, as you're reading David and Solomon and Hezekiah and Manasseh and all these other names, you're going, well, this guy's not acting like the way Deuteronomy says a king should act. This is all going to fall apart. And sure enough, it falls apart. And Solomon's the best example because he literally ticks off every box on the list of Deuteronomy's don'ts. And you're going, oh, Deuteronomy, and Solomon's presented as a great king. He's riding this high. He's great, great, great. But you know that he's ticking off all these boxes that Deuteronomy said don't do. And then all of a sudden, the bottom falls out. His kingdom's taken from him. And he's nothing. And what we're left to think about is the way that Solomon built himself up is just a hollow shell that will ultimately lead to ruin. Because Deuteronomy told us that. And so Deuteronomy becomes this book of wisdom and prophecy for us that, oh, this is how my life is going to turn out if I follow these ways. And then the book ends with Moses up on the mountain saying to the people, follow these commands. And holding a ritual, holding a ceremony where the people promise, they vow to follow the ways of God. They say to Moses, we are going to live out what God has for us. We are going to work out what God wants in our lives. So Moses, having brought the people from slavery to the brink of the promised land, has now fulfilled his job. He has done what he was supposed to do. He has solicited pledges from the people of Israel that they are going to live out what God wants for them. And now he's ready to die. And he gets one last look at this beautiful land that God is going to bring the people into. And he dies. And he is really taken from the people completely. He's buried in a place that we're not supposed to know where. In other words, Moses becomes this next level prophet who is so holy that even in his death God takes complete care of him. And he becomes this marker, this high watermark for leadership in the Bible. And we should be still looking at him as a high watermark for us to model ourselves after. Now, obviously, we as Christians have the high watermark of Jesus, and that should be our aspiration. But Moses should be one of those people that we look at and go, oh, yeah, okay. I need to be more like this guy too. I need to think about how truly great he was. And so that's how Deuteronomy ends, with this praise of Moses, and it provides a nice, convenient capstone for the books of Genesis through Numbers. Because at the end of Numbers, if you'll remember, the people are right there ready to take over the land. And this brings into a transition point. It brings us to a transition point so that when Joshua is ready to take over in Joshua 1, we're ready. We have a great idea of what's gone before us, and now we're looking into the future and ready for Joshua to move us forward. And so that's the book of Deuteronomy. I hope you enjoy it, and we will be back here at some point in the future for the book of Joshua.